Chapter 6. The First Anglo-Dutch War, 1642 to 1672. The Dutch greatly improved Elmina Castle. They restored the Bastion de France, connecting it with the main building by a long gallery, and generally extended and improved the fortifications until, in the course of a few years, the whole building had been very considerably enlarged. Having proved its weakness on the north-east, where it faced St. Jago's Hill, they set about remedying this serious defect as soon as possible. To this end, they built a strong fort on the summit of the hill in 1638, which was planned with 4 batteries and a tower, whence watch could be kept over a wide expanse of country and ships sighted 30 miles out at sea. It was named Fort Conradsburg, and garrisoned by an ensign's guard of 25 men, who were relieved every 24 hours. The greatest care was always taken to prevent the defences of this fort being inspected, and no strangers were ever admitted to it under any pretence, for the Dutch rightly regarded it as the key to the castle. They also built a stone bridge, with a wooden drawbridge in its centre, across the river Benya, and cut a wide road from it to the new fort. Another battery was then constructed on this side of the castle, and mounted with 6 guns, which covered the road to the fort and were capable of being turned on the latter in case of need, and a second smaller battery was raised on another hill as an additional protection to it. Besides these material improvements in the defences, a great deal of other work was carried out from time to time after years. Stone walls were built along the banks of the river Benya, converting it into a harbour into which small vessels could enter and, after passing through the drawbridge, refit under the guns of the castle. Many fine stone houses were also built, and some good roads made in the town rather later. Nor were these improvements confined to Elmina. At Maury, a half-moon was cut off Fort Nassau, and the buildings further improved and strengthened, and in about 1640 or 1642, the old Portuguese lodge at Chama and their own at Butry were converted into small forts with 4 batteries each. The former had been called San Sebastian by the Portuguese, and this name was now retained by the Dutch, while the fort at Butry, which was built by one Carolus, was named Fort Battenstein. Other lodges were built at Anamabo, Cormanton, Accra, and Corso, Cape Coast. Very little is definitely known of the history of the Gold Coast during the first few years after the expulsion of the Portuguese, and a great deal has to be inferred from subsequent records in which mention is made of forts and settlements then in existence at various places along the coast and possessed by different European nations. At this time, the enormous profits that were to be derived from the slave trade attracted others to the coast, and the Danes and Swedes soon began to compete with the English and Dutch, so that in all probability many interesting but unfortunately unrecorded disputes and transactions took place. After the final conquest of the Portuguese by the Dutch, all their settlements of course came into the possession of the latter nation, but though we find some of these places occupied by others very soon afterwards, it is impossible to decide whether these changes were brought about by the reoccupation of posts that had been abandoned by the Dutch, or by their forcible ejection from them. Thus important forts or castles are suddenly mentioned as being in existence at Christiansborg and Cape Coast, but of their origin next to nothing is known, and there were doubtless many other lodges built at this time. Christiansborg is said to have been occupied first by the Portuguese, from whom the Swedes took it in 1645, At this time, it seems to have been a fortified house rather than a fortress, and was known as Ursu Lodge. If it is true that the Portuguese were the first settlers there, this lodge was probably built after the demolition of their fort at Accra in 1578, and it is quite possible that they may have been here as late as 1645. For though they had lost both Elmina and Axim, the Dutch do not appear to have frequented the eastern districts of the Gold Coast until several years later. Cape Coast Castle, obscure though its early history is, seems to have witnessed many changes. Rhindorf, whose writings deal principally with the traditions of the Accra district, says, Cape Coast Castle, the castle at Cabo Corso, was built in the year 1652 by the Swedes. The foundation was laid by its commandant, Isaac Miville, a Swiss from Basel. The first name of the castle was Carolusburg, Charles's fort. In 1658 it was taken by the enterprising Heinrich Karloff, a native of Sweden, then in the service of the Danish company, and thus it fell into the hands of the Danes. But unfortunately Emanuel Schmid, the successor of Karloff, surrendered the castle to the Dutch in 1659. After this, the natives of Efutu, besieged Cape Coast Castle and took it in 1660, but the Swedes retook it from their hands and kept it from that year to 1663, when the Fetus retook it from the Swedes by surprise and treachery. Now the English, Danes, and Dutch respectively endeavoured to get possession of it by negotiation, but all failed. On the 2nd of May 1663, however, the Fetus voluntarily surrendered it to the Dutch. It had not been 1 year in their possession when it was attacked by Admiral Sir Robert Holmes by land and by sea, and captured on the 3rd of May 1664. Some of the latter part of this account is certainly incorrect, but it does not necessarily prove that there was no groundwork of truth in the remainder. Ellis sums up what is known of the early history of the building as follows. The question as to when Cape Coast Castle was built is involved in great obscurity. Smith, surveyor of the Royal African Company, who visited the Gold Coast in 1727, says the Portuguese founded it in 1610, while Barbeau, 1687, says it was built by the Dutch shortly after the capture of Elmina. Neither of these gives any authority for his statement, and Barbeau contradicts himself in 2 other places, saying in one that the Dutch had a pretty good fort at Cape Coast, which they bought of the factor of one Karloff, who had built it for the Danish company, and in the other that Cape Coast is famous for the castle the English built there. In any case, Smith is in error, for there is abundant evidence to show that the Portuguese had no fort at Cape Coast, and Barbeau's statement that it was built by the Dutch is directly traversed by the complaint made by the African Company in November 1662, in which it is said the Dutch had no factory at Cape Coast. There seems, therefore, but little doubt that Cape Coast Castle was built by the English, but at what date is uncertain. The probability is that it was built shortly before the formation of the Company of 1662, perhaps in 1662, for there is no mention made of it before January 1663. The Portuguese author Vasconcelos, however, in his Life of King John, writing of the time when the Portuguese were still in possession of Elmina, and therefore prior to the 1637 date, says of the Dutch that they held without any other right but force the fort at Boutro, 4 leagues from that at Axim, also the settlements of Cora, Cormantin, and Aldea del Tuerto at Comendo. This Cora can have been no other place than Cape Corea, as Cape Coast was often called. Meredith says the Danish force under Sir Henry Karloff, 1657, conquered the Swedish forts Carolusberg, now Cape Coast, Thackeray, Anamaboe, and Ursu Lodge, now Christiansborg. In another place, the same author says the castle was originally built by the Portuguese and ceded to the Dutch with their other possessions, in 1642. Barbeau again, writing of a Danish fort near the castle, which will be referred to later, says, the Danes being formerly expelled from Corso by the Dutch, made choice of that mount as a proper place to build a fort. The name Carolusborg suggests the possibility that this place may have been built or enlarged by the same Carolus who built Fort Battenstein for the Dutch in 1640, and though Ellis says there is abundant evidence to prove that the Portuguese had no fort at Cape Coast, yet he gives none, and the statement of Vasconcelos quoted above certainly seems to show that they had, and that the Dutch had ousted them from it. When Towerson was trading on the coast between 1555 and 1558, he was attacked by the Portuguese at Cape Coast, and in 1663 the Dutch governor of Elmina, Jean Valkenburg, complained that in 1647 the English had encouraged the Dutch vassals at Cabo Corso to rebel. But although these statements are so conflicting, there are several points on which they show a general agreement, and they are not really so irreconcilable as they appear to be. After the date of the voyages of Towerson, it is known that the Portuguese made very determined efforts to drive all strangers from the coast, and having already found the English trading at Cape Coast within 8 miles of their headquarters, there is nothing more likely than they would have established a small fortified post or a lodge there to protect their interests. This may very possibly have been built in about 1610, but when a little later their trade declined and the garrisons were weakened, this would have been one of the first places that they would have abandoned. This would be quite sufficient to account for the absence of all opposition to the landing of the Dutch in 1637, which is presumably the evidence upon which Ellis was relying. The deserted lodge would then have come into the possession of the Dutch, who apparently did not think it was worth garrisoning, so that when in after years the Swedes resorted to the coast, they were able to settle at this place without opposition. Their occupation of Cape Coast is said to date from 1652, and there is a general agreement that in 1657 or 1658, Karloff dispossessed them and took the place for the Danish company. What happened after this is very doubtful, and the place may have changed hands more than once, and even have been taken by the Fetus and passed from them back again to the Dutch, as is alleged, before it came into the possession of the English, as it undoubtedly had done by 1662 or 1663. Until then, the fort was probably no more than a lodge, and it was at this time that the castle itself seems to have been built, either as an addition to and improvement on the original lodge, or near it. It is most likely, however, that the latter course was adopted, and that the fortified house close to the castle, and occupied by a native trading agent or middleman, which will be referred to later, was the old lodge which had been left untouched and handed over to him. The Acras were at first as strongly opposed to the erection of European forts in their country as they had been in the time of the Portuguese, and it was not until about 1642 that the Danes and Dutch, after giving considerable presents to the king, succeeded in obtaining his permission to build storehouses, undertaking to pay 7 marks of gold, or £224, annually for this concession. Having once secured a footing in the place in this manner, they continually insinuated the necessity of converting these houses into proper forts in order to protect the Accras in time of need from the attacks of their inveterate foes, the Akwamus. This was at last agreed to, and the Dutch then built a stone fort with a tiled roof, which they named Crèvecoeur. It was completed in about the year 1650, but it was not until some years later, 1673 in fact, that the English were given a similar privilege. At this time, the Swedes held Ursu Lodge, but in 1657, Frederick III of Denmark sent an expedition to the Gold Coast under Sir Henry Carlof, the same who has already been mentioned as probably having taken Cape Coast Castle from the Swedes, who drove them out of the place and garrisoned it for the Danes. It was afterwards much enlarged and strengthened and renamed Christiansborg. A year later, in 1658, the Danes built a fort on a hill at Amanfu, about 3/4 of a mile to the east of Cape Coast, which they named Fredericksborg. The hill itself was known as Dienstein, or the Danish Mount, and it was the governor of this place who enlarged and renamed Ursu Lodge. In 1651, the charter granted 20 years earlier by Charles I was renewed and confirmed to Rowland Wilson and some other merchants by the English Commonwealth. The confusion of these times, however, had a most disastrous effect on the affairs of the company, which had hitherto made large profits, with the result that the Dutch, Danes, and Swedes increased their influence and trade on the Gold Coast at the expense of the English. So great were the losses of the English during the next few years, owing to this competition of other nations, that although a frigate was sent out in 1652 to protect the trade from the interference of the Dutch, and Lord Ambassador Whitelock was dispatched to the Swedish court in 1653 to remonstrate against the encroachments of that nation, yet the losses of the private traders alone, apart from those of the company, in ships and goods taken, are said to have amounted to considerably over 250,000 sterling. From 1660 onwards, there were continual bickerings between the English and the Dutch, which finally resulted in actual war. In that year, a formal protest was lodged by the then English ambassador at The Hague, but so far from any benefit arising from it, the Dutch aggressions against the English company seem to have steadily increased in the ensuing years. In August 1661, the Dutch captured an English ship, the Merchant's Delight, and took her to Elmina, where her crew were imprisoned in the castle by Governor Jasper van Housen. While in the November of the following year, further complaints were made against the Dutch on account of aggressions at Comenda and Cape Coast, at neither of which, according to the English statements, had they any factory at that time. The Dutch were doubtless much annoyed to find that after they had achieved their ambition and driven out the Portuguese, they had even more competition to contend with than before. They were therefore doing their best to put a stop to this also, so that they might realize their dream of becoming supreme on the Gold Coast. In 1662, one of their men of war, the Golden Lion, fired on the boats of an English ship as they were going ashore at Cape Coast, but, try as they would, they could not succeed in driving their rivals from the coast. In 1662, a new company was formed under a charter granted by Charles II and dated the 10th of January. This company was called the Company of Royal Adventurers of England, trading to Africa, and their charter gave them the sole trading rights from the Straits of Gibraltar to the Cape of Good Hope. It included many influential persons, amongst whom was the king's brother, James, Duke of York, who undertook to supply 3,000 slaves yearly to the West Indies and was to maintain posts at Cape Coast, Anashan, Comenda, Egia and Accra, besides a factory at Winnabar and their fort at Cormanton. The headquarters, too, were to be removed from Cormanton to Cape Coast, where the chief agent was to be assisted by 2 other merchants, a warehouse keeper and a gold taker, 2 accountants and 3 assistant factors. The castle was said to be garrisoned by 50 English soldiers and 30 slaves under the command of a captain and 4 sergeants. The garrison at Anashan was to consist of 10 English soldiers and 8 slaves, while 2 of each were allotted to each of the other lodges. The slave trade thus received the formal sanction of the government and the direct patronage of the royal family. The formation of this company was strongly resented by the Dutch. On the 28th of May, 1663, the King of Aguna, at their instigation, plundered the factory at Winnabar, and less than a week later, on the 1st of June, Governor Jean Valkenburg lodged a formal protest against the action of the company's agents in setting up factories in places which he asserted belonged to the Dutch West India Company by right of conquest of the Portuguese. A few days later, the Dutch showed their animosity towards the company by more active measures. They surprised the garrison of Cape Coast Castle, seized the fortress, and by means of bribes and promises induced the King of Fantin to attack the English fort at Cormanton, after first arranging with the King of Aguna to secure the person of John Cabes, the local chief, who was a staunch supporter of the English. The capture of Cormanton was prevented by the opportune arrival of Captain Stokes with reinforcements, but the Dutch took the factory at Egia. As a result of these continual quarrels, the company was quite unable to make any progress, and in 1664 representations were made in Parliament on the subject of insolence and aggression from the Dutch, and Sir George Downing was instructed to demand full reparation from the States General. The Dutch chief factor at Fort Nassau at the same time handed a written protest to Captain Stokes on board the Marmaduke, complaining of the erection of the factory at Anashan by the English, and setting forth that the Dutch had not only won the coast from the Portuguese at great expense and at the cost of many lives, but that the monopoly of the whole trade had been formally granted to their West India Company. There was certainly a great deal of truth in these contentions of the Dutch, but they had been so busy improving Elmina and their other stations after the expulsion of the Portuguese that they had not troubled to interfere very much with the English while they were still weak, and now that their position on the coast was stronger and their trade had developed sufficiently to arouse the jealousy of the Dutch, it was too late for the latter to protest. The Dutch had now committed a distinct act of war by seizing Cape Coast Castle, and Sir George Downing having failed to obtain any redress from the government at The Hague, Charles II at once dispatched Captains Robert Holmes and Joseph Cubits in the Jersey and another man of war, together with 6 frigates and the same number of smaller vessels, with secret orders to proceed to the west coast of Africa and capture the Dutch fort at Goree, thus commencing the Dutch wars. Having taken Goree in accordance with these instructions, Holmes sailed down the coast and reaching Tagaradi on the 9th of April, took Fort Ritson and left an English garrison in it. Fort St. Sebastian was the next to fall, and this was practically leveled with the ground and abandoned, so that the Dutch were able to reoccupy it almost at once. They built a palisade fence around it as a temporary protection, and, though they were again attacked by the English and the people of Jabi, succeeded in driving them off and eventually rebuilt the place. Cape Coast Castle was next recaptured on the 7th of May. It had been defended by less than 20 Dutchmen, but Holmes now left a garrison of 50 men to hold it and supply them with provisions for 6 months and materials and labourers for the repair of its defences. According to Barbeau, who less than 20 years after these events was on very friendly terms with the Danes and used to visit them at Fort Fredericksburg, they assisted the English on this occasion and were allowed to retain their position in return for these services. Fort Nassau at Maury and the lodges at Anamabo and Egia were all taken in turn, and according to Dapper, the greatest barbarity was shown to the Dutch garrison of the latter place. He alleges that though the English had given quarter, they cut off the ears and noses of all their prisoners and afterwards cut the throats of some, butchering them like so many pigs. Others were flayed alive, and even the dead were disinterred in order that their heads might be cut off and carried in triumph on the ends of the English pikes. In the plate of Fort St. Anthony at Axim in Barber's work, the small island in front of the fort is marked as the large rock on which Admiral Ruyter raised a battery of 12 guns with which he forced the fort to surrender, from which it also appears that Holmes must have taken this place also. The Dutch had thus been taken completely by surprise, and Holmes, having fully avenged the seizure of Cape Coast Castle by the capture of nearly all their forts, now returned to England. He left the English in a far stronger position than they had ever before occupied, but unfortunately they were not supplied with enough men to enable them to maintain it when the Dutch began to retaliate. The news of these depredations of Holmes had no sooner reached Holland than Admiral de Ruyter was ordered to sail from Gibraltar, where he then lay with a fleet of 13 ships, to make good the losses of the Dutch company. He began by recapturing Goree on the 11th of October, 1664, and then sailed on to the coast to retake Cape Coast Castle, which was the principal object of his expedition. Having destroyed a few English factories between Sierra Leone and the Crewe coast, he made an unsuccessful attack on Fort Whitson on Christmas Day. Only a part of his force had been engaged, but he was then reinforced by 900 Elminas who had been sent down by Governor Valkenburg, and the fort was taken on the 15th of January, 1665. The village was burned and its whole population put to the sword, while the English garrison, which consisted of only some 8 or 10 men, half of whom were sick, were stripped naked and otherwise grossly ill-treated. The guns were taken off to the ship, but the fort itself was blown up with 1,200 pounds of powder, as it was thought that the cost of its maintenance would outweigh any profits that could be derived from its trade. The fort is said to have been at one time and another in the possession of the English, Dutch, Danes, Swedes, Brandenburgers, and French, but though it doubtless witnessed some unrecorded changes, it can never have been held by the Brandenburgers, for they did not appear on the coast until some years after it had been destroyed. It is quite possible, however, that all these different nations may have occupied the place, though not this identical fort. The Elmina auxiliaries are described as wearing helmets furnished with plumes of feathers and ornamented with 1 or 2 pairs of horns fixed at their front. They carried swords, the wooden hilts of which were carved in the shape of a leopard's jawbone, and many of them had painted their bodies red or yellow. De Ruyter next went down to Cape Coast Castle, which had now been repaired and further fortified by the English. Governor Valkenburg attached the very greatest importance to the recapture of this place, for it was believed that if the English could be deprived of the castle, which was their chief stronghold on the coast, they would give up all hope of re-establishing themselves and retire from the Gold Coast altogether, leaving the Dutch in undisputed possession. On reconnoitring the place, however, de Ruyter discovered that it was only possible to land in safety on one narrow strip of sand on the eastern side of the castle, which, besides being swept by the guns, could easily have been held by 100 resolute men against 1,000. The people, moreover, refused to assist the Dutch, and threatened to side with the English if necessary, so that, as it was clear that they could have stopped the paths and cut off all access to the fresh water and other supplies, and that any force he might succeed in landing would be starving within 2 or 3 days if the castle held out, de Ruyter contented himself with expressing his astonishment that the Dutch should ever have permitted the English to retake the place when once they had gained it, and declined to risk an attempt that seemed bound to end in disaster. Leaving Cape Coast, therefore, he went to Maury, where with the assistance of his Elmina allies, he recaptured Fort Nassau, repaired its fortifications, and left a garrison of Europeans with 50 natives to hold it, while he returned himself to Elmina. General Valkenburg had been deeply chagrined by the admiral's refusal to attack Cape Coast Castle, and now represented to him the greatest damage that was done to the Dutch trade by the English forts at Anamabo and Cormantin, urging him at least to attempt the capture of these places. He undertook to prove that the presence of the English at Cormantin did more damage to the Dutch trade than Holmes had done during his whole expedition. The admiral was at first reluctant to attack Cormantin, but having been assured of the friendship and assistance of the Anamabos and Egyas, he agreed to make the attempt. Leaving Elmina, he touched at Maury and embarked the Dutch garrison of Fort Nassau, and then sailed on to Cormantin, anchoring off it on the 6th of February, 1665, in company with a fleet of 400 or 500 canoes, manned by the Elminas. On the 7th, 900 men were detached and sent with the Elminas in the ship's boats to effect a landing at Anamabo, where, though there was a small lodge in the possession of the English, the landing was much safer than at Cormantin, and de Ruyter expected to be joined by his other allies. On nearing the landing place after a hard pull against the wind and tide, the boats were fired upon by the Cormantins, who, led by their chief John Cabes, had marched over and were lying concealed behind the rocks and bushes. So heavy was their fire and that of the English lodge that the Dutch, believing that the king of Anamabo must have played them false, turned around, and rowed back to their ships. But though the English had thus succeeded in beating off the enemy, it was more than they had expected. So confident indeed had they felt that the Dutch would land and attack their fort at Egia on their way to Cormantin, that the garrison had mined it and lighted a long fuse calculated to blow the place up when the enemy reached and entered it. They had then abandoned it and retired to Cormantin. The explosion followed in due course and wrecked the fort, but the unexpected retreat of the Dutch foiled the second part of their scheme. In spite of this reverse, de Ruyter did not despair of taking Cormantin. He had now been joined by Valkenburg, and the evening messengers arrived from the king of Anamabo, bringing hostages and assuring the Dutch of his fidelity. The Anamabos explained that the failure in the morning was not due to any fault of theirs, but to the fact that the Dutch had made the attempt too soon and before they had time to win over the Cormantins. That same night, a second messenger, named Antonio, came from the king, bringing word that he hoped to complete his arrangements by the next morning, and that as soon as he had done so, he would hoist the Dutch flag on the ruins of Egia Fort as a signal to them to land. On the morning of the 8th, this signal was seen, and as there was very little surf, the Dutch force landed in good order near Egia. Here they were joined by their allies, and by midday the whole force, consisting of between 1,000 and 1,100 Europeans and 3,000 natives, was concentrated at Anamabo. The allies were then provided with white scarves to distinguish them from those of the English. General Valkenburg now sent a letter to the English commandant of Cormantin, summoning him to surrender, and moved his whole force onto a hill a little to the west of the fort, and about a musket shot from it. Here they met with a far more determined resistance than had been anticipated. Not only was a terrific fire maintained from the fort, but a force of about 300 Cormantins was also opposed to them. These men, led by John Cabes, inflicted such heavy losses on the Dutch allies that the path soon became blocked with the bodies of their slain. Brave, however, as the Cormantins were, it was impossible that they could hold out for long against the immensely superior numbers of the Dutch force, and though they stubbornly disputed every yard of ground, they were slowly driven back onto the fort. The Dutch now set fire to the village, and under cover of the smoke, which was blown directly onto the fort, brought up grenades and mortars and prepared to make the final assault. But the English garrison, realizing that their position was now hopeless, and finding such numbers of the enemy close under their very walls, removed the red cross from their flag, thus converting it into a flag of truce, and opened the gate. The Dutch took 150 pounds weight of gold in this fort, and gave a quarter to the garrison, leaving 80 of their own soldiers from Elmina and Maury in their place. The gallant chief of Cormantin, John Cabes, who had been so ardent a supporter of the English, committed suicide rather than fall into the enemy's hands. The Dutch offered a large reward for his head, but he was buried by his people at Old Cormantin, and the only satisfaction his enemies obtained was the little they could derive from blowing up his house. On the fall of Cormantin, the few men in the lodge at Anamabo at once capitulated. The Dutch had paid a heavy price for their victory, however. They lost 49 Europeans alone, and their levies had fared even worse. These levies were paid 62 marks, or £1,984 for their services, and the Fantis expressed great satisfaction at seeing the Dutch reinstated at Cormantin, complaining bitterly of the inconveniences they had suffered during the English occupation. They took this opportunity to gain an important concession from the Dutch, who agreed to pay them 300 guilders, or £26 and 5 shillings, for every one of the company's vessels, other than slave ships, that traded there. This cost the Dutch a great deal in the end, for the people soon demanded and obtained payment for every ship alike. The Dutch named this fort Fort Amsterdam, and a few years later, in 1681 and 1682, considerably enlarged it and improved its defences. By the time de Ruyter left the coast, the only post left to the English was Cape Coast Castle, and a company of royal adventurers petitioned the king on the subject of their losses. They tried to represent themselves as the innocent sufferers for the misdeeds of Holmes, and declared that they had neither sanctioned nor profited by these actions of his which had now brought upon them the reprisals of de Ruyter. They entirely ignored the fact that their factors and troops had occupied all the Dutch forts that Holmes had taken, and that had matters turned out differently, they would have been the very first to have hailed him as a hero and benefactor instead of lodging complaints against him. They further alleged that they had, since the formation of the company, established and maintained forts and trading posts at Cape Coast, Tantum Quarry, Cormanton, Anashan, Ahanta, probably Butry, Winneba, and Accra, besides other places beyond the confines of the Gold Coast, and had, since their incorporation, sent out goods to the total value of £158,000 and brought away gold to the annual value of £200,000 and slaves worth another £100,000. The whole of this lucrative trade had now been ruined by De Ruyter, and they prayed that the Dutch prizes that had been taken during the war might be handed over to them as some compensation for the losses they had sustained. This appeal was doubtless supported by the Duke of York and others who were financially interested in the well-being of the company, and was, to some extent at any rate, granted, for in April 1666 the Dutch man-of-war Golden Lion was handed over to the company. In 1666, Villo made his voyage to the Gold Coast, and from the account he wrote of it, the condition of the affairs at that time appears to have been as follows. The Dutch were in possession of Elmina, Cormanton, Axim, Maury, and Butry, and had lodges at Anamabo and Fantin, possibly Egya. Cape Coast Castle belonged to the English, who had also re-established themselves at Anashan, and the Danes held Fredericksborg and Christiansborg. While he was lying near Secondi, Villo received a letter from Harry Dahlbrecher of Hamburg, who was then governor of Fredericksborg, offering him the use of his harbour in consideration of the alliance between their respective countries, and asking him to reserve him some of his goods. Villo therefore anchored off the fort, and the governor's secretary came off to fetch the goods that had been ordered, but was prevented from returning on shore that night by a tornado that suddenly sprang up. The next morning, as he was being rowed back from the ship, the English at Cape Coast Castle fired on his boat, the ball falling within a few feet of it. Fort Fredericksborg immediately replied with a shot at the castle, which fell at the foot of the second battery, whereupon the English, seeing that they were under the Danish governor's protection, fired a round of blank. He says that although war had been declared between the English and Danes on account of the Dutch, yet the governors of Cape Coast Castle and Fredericksborg had a mutual understanding by which they remained neutral and on good terms with each other, the two garrisons meeting and drinking together daily. The Danish governor informed Villo that the natives had been continuously at war with one another for the past 4 years, and that, as a result, the country around Accra had been so devastated that the garrison at Christiansborg were unable to obtain supplies locally, and provisions had to be sent them regularly from Fredericksborg. Villo further learned that the Axims had recently murdered the Dutch commandant of Fort St. Anthony and declared for the English, but if this be true, nothing seems to have come of it. He was also told that the English had been intriguing with the King of Fantin to help them to regain possession of their fort at Cormanton, and had taken his son as a hostage, but finding him unable or unwilling to fulfill his part of the contract, they now refused to give up the son. The king had, therefore, tried to lay hands on some of the Dutch in the hope of effecting an exchange, and had recently seized the commandant of Cormanton and 4 others while they were on a visit to Anamabo, killing 2 of their escort in the scuffle. The Fantis also made a night attack on the Sabos while Villot was at Anashan, killing 4 men and taking others prisoners, and thus started a war between the two tribes. Peace was restored between England and Holland by the conclusion of the Treaty of Breda in 1667. By the third article, it was stipulated that each side should be restored to the places it had held before the war. The Dutch retained Cormantin and the English Cape Coast. But though this treaty ended the war, it did not entirely put a stop to the quarrels between the English and the Dutch on the Gold Coast. The English soon re-established themselves at Egia, and of this the Dutch complained in 1668, affirming that as the post was under the guns of Cormantin, it must necessarily have been ceded to them with it. In July of the same year, the commanders rose against the Dutch, plundered their factory there and murdered the garrison, to avenge which the Dutch declared a blockade of the coast, which was to include not only Commander but the whole of Fetu and Cape Coast, the people of which were suspected of having connived with the commanders in making this attack. The English, however, on being called upon to assist in enforcing this measure, very naturally declined to do so on the ground that their principal fort lay within the prescribed area. It could not, therefore, be carried out. In the following year, 1669, another war broke out between the Akwamus and the Kras, which lasted for many years and laid waste to a vast extent of the country. The company of royal adventurers had had a most unfortunate career, floated as it was at a most inopportune moment. Great difficulty had been found in persuading people to risk their money in what at that time was generally regarded as a very speculative concern. The result was that the company had been compelled to start business with insufficient stock, and the outbreak of hostilities with the Dutch so soon afterwards led to expenses and losses which they were quite unable to bear, and left them in debt for very large amounts. They had now not only lost a great deal of what they had originally had, but were by no means certain of being able to retain what still remained to them, and certainly had no prospects of being able to extend their possessions. Had they started with a larger capital in the first instance, they might have been able to weather the storm, and in time make good their losses. But as matters stood, they were compelled to surrender their charter to the crown, and for a fixed sum transferred all their possessions and interests to another company which was about to be formed.